A man can have everything in life and still lose what truly matters. Harold, a millionaire accustomed to looking down on those beneath him, never imagined that a simple dismissal would be the first step toward a radical change. He fired Margaret, his black housekeeper, in a cold and humiliating manner, not even sparing her a backward glance. What Harold didn't realize was that this woman, whom he thought he had left behind, was destined to transform his life in ways he would never forget. Harold was the kind of person who believed that money could solve any problem. Owner of a vast fortune, he lived surrounded by luxury but far removed from any true emotional connection. His decisions were quick, calculated, and often ruthless. To him, people were replaceable, disposable pieces in his constant pursuit of efficiency. Margaret, however, was his complete opposite. She had worked for Harold for 5 years, not wealthy but carrying a quiet strength. A mother of 2, she worked tirelessly to ensure her children had a dignified life. Every day, she arrived at the mansion before dawn, cleaning, organizing, cooking, and leaving late at night with a sense of accomplishment. Yet to Harold, Margaret was invisible. On that particular morning, Harold woke up in a foul mood. A major business deal had fallen through, and he needed someone to bear the brunt of his frustration. While Margaret was cleaning the living room, a crystal glass slipped off the table and shattered on the floor with a piercing crash. She froze, knowing it wouldn't go unnoticed. "You're only good at one thing, aren't you? Making a mess." Harold's voice sliced through the silence like a knife. Still stunned, Margaret tried to explain that it was an accident, but he gave her no room to speak. "Enough. Gather your things and leave. I don't want you here anymore." For a moment, Margaret stood still, holding back tears. She looked at Harold, searching for a hint of empathy, some recognition of the years she had devoted to that house. But he simply stared at her with indifference before turning his back and walking out. With a heavy heart, Margaret collected her few belongings. Each step toward the door was filled with a mix of shame and anguish. How would she explain this to her children? Who would hire a woman her age in such a competitive job market? As she crossed the threshold for the last time, a single tear rolled down her cheek. Harold, on the other hand, didn't spend a single minute reflecting on his decision. To him, Margaret was just another replaceable employee. But fate had plans in store that even the mighty Harold couldn't foresee. Margaret walked to the bus stop with slumped shoulders, clutching a small bag of her belongings. Every step felt heavier than the last, not from physical exhaustion but from the emotional blow she had just endured. The cold morning wind cut through her skin, and for the first time in a long while, she felt completely lost. When she arrived home, her 2 children, 10-year-old Jacob and 6-year-old Abigail, greeted her with laughter as they ran around the living room, oblivious to the harsh reality that awaited them. Margaret forced a smile as she ran her hands through their hair, trying to hide the worry tightening her chest. She locked herself in her room for a few minutes to compose herself. Sitting on the edge of her bed, she stared at the stack of bills that now seemed more overwhelming than ever. At that moment, Margaret realized she had no choice but to be strong. She couldn't afford to give in to despair. Her children depended on her, and that was all that mattered. The next day, Margaret left early to look for work. Armed with a simple resume and few formal qualifications, she faced condescending looks and closed doors. The fake smiles and canned responses, "We'll be in touch," were always the same. What stung the most wasn't the disdain of strangers but the memory of Harold's cold gaze, so devoid of emotion, as if her years of dedication had meant nothing. That memory clung to her like a shadow. That evening, as she prepared a thin soup for her children, Jacob watched her silently. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked, his serious expression far beyond his years. Margaret hesitated but replied firmly, "Yes, sweetheart. Everything's going to be fine." But deep down, doubt gnawed at her. Was she being realistic in thinking she could start over? That night, Margaret cried silently as her children slept. It wasn't just fear for the future, it was the feeling that her worth as a person had been trampled. Yet something inside her refused to give up. She knew she couldn't afford to stop fighting. Meanwhile, in his empty mansion, Harold continued his routine, oblivious to the ripple effects of his actions. He remained cocooned in his world of comfort, far from the consequences of his choices. But as fate often proves, no one escapes the weight of their decisions. Waking up early had always been a habit for Margaret, but now, with no clear destination, the sound of her alarm echoed in an unsettling emptiness. Days began to blur together. Between visits to employment agencies and long walks around the city, she found herself reflecting on everything she had lost. During one of these walks, Margaret noticed a small corner restaurant. The smell of freshly baked bread and hot coffee made her pause for a moment. A "Help Wanted" sign in the window caught her eye. Without overthinking, she stepped inside. The restaurant was modest, with simple tables and a counter where a cheerful older woman served the few customers present. Margaret approached and inquired about the job. The woman, who introduced herself as Clara, studied Margaret curiously. "Have you ever worked in a kitchen before?" Margaret responded confidently, without hesitation, "I know how to cook, clean, organize, whatever you need." Clara seemed to weigh her words carefully before asking, "Can you start tomorrow?" It was a small victory, but to Margaret, it felt like she had won the world. The next day, she arrived early, as she always did. She put on a simple apron and got to work. As she chopped vegetables and washed dishes, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: hope. The atmosphere in the restaurant was different. Clara, though demanding, treated Margaret with respect. The customers were kind, and some even complimented the dishes Margaret helped prepare. These small gestures reminded her that, despite her hardships, she still had worth. Over time, Margaret began suggesting changes to the menu, simple recipes packed with flavor. Clara, initially hesitant, gave her ideas a chance. They were a hit. Customers started requesting Margaret's dishes, and soon the restaurant saw a steady stream of new patrons. Amid all this, Margaret discovered something within herself she didn't know she had: a knack for leadership and creativity. For the first time, she felt in control of something, and it motivated her to push forward. Meanwhile, Harold remained absorbed in his world of comfort and indifference, oblivious to the journey Margaret was beginning to carve, a path that, sooner or later, would cross his again. Months passed, and Margaret began to find something she hadn't felt in a long time: stability. At Clara's restaurant, she worked hard, but now her efforts were recognized. The compliments from customers and Clara's trust in her ideas gave Margaret a quiet but growing confidence that she hadn't realized was there. One night, after putting her children to bed, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with an old notebook. She started jotting down recipes she had made for her kids during tough times. Simple food, but with flavors that brought comfort. As she wrote, an idea began to take shape. Margaret wanted more than just a job. She wanted to build something of her own, something born from her dedication that could provide lasting security for her family. But how? The question lingered in her mind every day. Slowly, she began sharing her thoughts with Clara. Clara, who had become more than just a boss, listened attentively. "You have a rare talent, Margaret. Have you ever thought about offering your dishes in your own place?" Margaret laughed, a little shy. "I don't have the money for that. And who would trust me to do something so big?" But the seed had been planted. That same week, Clara invited Margaret to participate in a community event, a small festival where local restaurant owners could showcase their food. Clara suggested Margaret prepare some of her most popular dishes and sell them at a small booth. Margaret accepted the challenge. She worked late into the night for several days, testing recipes and perfecting the details. Jacob and Abigail helped as much as they could, whether by tasting the food or simply keeping her company while she cooked. When the day of the festival arrived, Margaret was nervous but determined. Her booth was simple, with an improvised sign that read, "Homestyle Flavors." The aroma of her dishes soon drew people in, and before she knew it, the line in front of her booth was longer than she ever thought possible. The compliments were endless, but what moved Margaret the most were the people who said her food reminded them of home, of simpler, happier times. It touched her deeply. That night, as she counted the money she had earned, Margaret realized she had taken the first step towards something greater. It wasn't just about the money or the food. It was about proving her worth, something Harold had never seen. While Margaret felt the spark of a dream taking shape, Harold, distant and unaware, continued living in his bubble. But their paths were inching closer, and it was only a matter of time before their worlds collided once more. As Margaret began to build something solid with effort and determination, Harold's life started to crumble, slowly and silently. Harold had always believed he had everything under control. Though his wealth was vast, it relied heavily on high-risk investments, and he enjoyed living on the edge. The people around him rarely questioned his decisions. After all, Harold wasn't a man who listened to advice. What started as small financial issues quickly snowballed into something much bigger. A series of poor decisions and the betrayal of a business partner left him in a precarious position. Harold tried to fix the situation, but each attempt only seemed to pull him further down. Within months, he lost properties, investments, and, most painfully, his reputation. Invitations to exclusive events stopped, friends began avoiding him, and for the first time, Harold experienced something entirely foreign to him: loneliness. His mansion, once bustling with staff, became eerily empty. To cut costs, he let go of most of his employees, keeping only the bare minimum. Sitting in his office, surrounded by luxurious furniture that now felt meaningless, Harold began to reflect. But his reflection wasn't about the people he had hurt or the ways he could have acted differently. Instead, he fixated on how to regain what he'd lost, how to climb back to the top, and how to prove he was still important. One evening, while eating alone in the kitchen for the first time in years, Harold thought of Margaret. He couldn't clearly remember her face, but the image of someone serving his meals or cleaning his living room surfaced briefly in his mind. He shook his head, dismissing the thought as unimportant. Days later, Harold began selling off his assets to pay his debts. Artwork, luxury cars, everything he once flaunted as symbols of status now became mere numbers on a spreadsheet. Yet the financial hole seemed bottomless. Harold started frequenting simpler places, something unthinkable in his former life. He walked streets he'd never noticed before, where ordinary people worked and struggled to make ends meet. But he didn't see their humanity. To Harold, they were only reminders of what he feared becoming. Even in the midst of his downfall, Harold failed to grasp the deeper meaning of it all. His arrogance kept him blind to the reality that sometimes, loss isn't just material, it's moral. Meanwhile, Margaret, unaware of Harold's troubles, continued moving forward with her life. She was getting closer to achieving something she hadn't dared to dream of. Margaret never imagined that her small booth at the festival would be the start of something so significant. The unexpected success of that day opened new doors, and with Clara's support, she began expanding her ideas. Clara suggested that Margaret use the restaurant's kitchen after hours to prepare meals for delivery around the city. It was a risk, but Margaret embraced it. Using the modest profits from the festival, she bought ingredients and stayed up late cooking. Jacob and Abigail pitched in however they could, folding packaging and handing out flyers they designed themselves. At first, sales were slow, but the care and flavor in Margaret's meals soon began to attract attention. Clara's restaurant patrons placed orders and spread the word to their friends. Within weeks, Margaret couldn't keep up with the demand. One day, while delivering an order, Margaret met a reporter from a local newspaper. Curious about the story behind the meals, the reporter asked for an interview. Margaret, still in disbelief that anyone would be interested in her journey, shared everything, from the tough days following her dismissal to Clara's support and her children's hard work. The article was published under the headline, "From Fired Housekeeper to Inspiring Entrepreneur." It was enough to make Margaret a local sensation. People wanted to taste the dishes made by someone so resilient and determined. As demand grew, Margaret rented a small space in the neighborhood to set up her own kitchen. It wasn't large, but it was hers. She hired 2 women, both of whom, like her, were looking for a fresh start. Her business became more than just about food, it became a source of hope for others. Margaret began receiving invitations to community events and speaking engagements about overcoming adversity. Although she still faced challenges, like tight finances and physical exhaustion, she felt she was on the right path. Meanwhile, Harold, buried in his world of losses, remained oblivious to the waves Margaret was making. To him, she was still a distant figure from a past he preferred to forget. But life was weaving their stories together, and their reunion was just around the corner. It was an ordinary day at the small restaurant Margaret now managed, with pots bubbling, customers coming and going, and the lively hum of conversations filling the air. Yet, something extraordinary was about to happen. Harold, who had lost almost everything, was walking slowly through the neighborhood streets. His life was unrecognizable from what it once was. His expensive suits had been replaced by simple clothes, and the confident sparkle in his eyes had dimmed into an expression of defeat. Hungry and directionless, Harold was drawn to the scent of home-cooked food wafting from Margaret's restaurant. Without paying much attention to his surroundings, he followed the aroma inside, compelled by a nostalgia he couldn't quite place. Margaret was at the counter, jotting down an order, when her eyes met Harold's. She froze, time seeming to stop for a moment. He was thinner, his face weary, but there was no mistaking who he was. Harold didn't immediately recognize Margaret. He ordered a meal and found a quiet corner to sit, trying to blend into the background. Margaret, however, was overwhelmed with a flood of emotions, anger, pain, and an unexpected sense of curiosity. She prepared his plate personally, infusing it with the same care she gave every customer. When she brought it to his table, Harold looked up, and recognition hit him like a lightning bolt. The shock was plain on his face. He stammered, trying to form words, but none came. Margaret remained composed. "I hope you enjoy your meal," she said with a restrained smile before walking away. Harold stared at the plate in front of him, a mixture of shame and astonishment filling his chest. As he ate, Harold watched Margaret from a distance, memories of their past interactions rushing back. He wanted to say something, but he didn't know where to start. The weight of his past actions pressed heavily on him, magnified by the resilience of the woman who had clearly risen above them. When he finished his meal, Harold approached the counter. "Margaret, he began, but the words failed him. Margaret held his gaze for a moment before responding. "I hope you enjoyed your meal. You look like you needed it." Her voice was steady, devoid of hostility. She knew this wasn't the time to say everything she had carried in her heart for years. Harold left the restaurant with a heavy heart and a mind full of thoughts. Margaret watched him through the window, uncertain of her own emotions. But one thing was clear, this encounter was just the beginning of something much larger. In the days following their unexpected meeting, Harold couldn't stop thinking about Margaret. Shame consumed him as he replayed the memories of how he had treated her. He knew he had made a mistake but didn't know how to make amends. Margaret, too, found herself reflecting on what had happened. Though the reunion reopened old wounds, she felt there was a deeper purpose behind the moment. Margaret was no longer the woman Harold had fired years ago, and that realization gave her strength. A week later, Harold returned to the restaurant. Margaret saw him enter and couldn't help but feel a mix of curiosity and caution. He ordered a coffee and waited patiently, trying not to disrupt the bustling activity. When the coffee arrived, Harold nervously asked for a moment to speak with her. "Margaret," he began, his voice trembling, "I know I don't deserve your attention, but I need to say something. I deeply regret what I did. There's no excuse for the way I treated you. Please, forgive me." Margaret studied him, carefully weighing his words. She had waited years to hear something like this, but the impact wasn't what she had imagined. Instead of immediate relief, his apology brought back the pain she had buried. "Harold," she said calmly but firmly, "what you did changed my life. It wasn't easy, but I survived. What you failed to understand back then is that people like me have value, not because we clean your homes or cook your meals, but because we're human. That's something you seem to ignore." Harold lowered his head, his shame evident. "I know. I'm trying to change. I don't know how, but I want to be a better person." His words caught Margaret off guard. Part of her wanted to believe him, but another part remembered the years of disdain he had shown. "That's something you'll have to prove, Harold. Words are just a beginning. The respect you never showed me won't be fixed with apologies, it'll take actions." Harold nodded, accepting her words as absolute truth. He realized that regret alone wouldn't be enough to make things right. Margaret, on the other hand, felt a surprising sense of peace. She no longer carried anger. That conversation wasn't for Harold to ease his guilt, it was for her to release the pain she had held onto for so long. As Harold left the restaurant, there was a tension in the air, but also something new, the possibility of change, growth, and redemption. Margaret's words lingered in Harold's mind for days. He had always believed that money was the only way to earn respect, but now he was starting to grasp the truth, that the value of people, something he had ignored for so long, was what truly mattered. Harold began to engage with the community, a step he had never taken before. At first, it was out of necessity. The places he now frequented were humble, and the people he once dismissed were now the ones sharing tables and stories with him. He found work at a small mechanic shop, helping with basic tasks. It wasn't glamorous, but Harold knew he had to start somewhere. There, he witnessed the daily grind of men and women who gave everything they had to provide for their families. The experience was transformative, and for the first time, Harold began to understand the dignity of work driven not by luxury, but by necessity and sacrifice. One afternoon, on his day off, Harold decided to return to Margaret's restaurant. This time, he wasn't just looking for food, he wanted to show her he was trying. As he stepped inside, he noticed Margaret in her element, coordinating staff, serving customers, and maintaining her warm smile. It was inspiring. He waited patiently until the rush subsided, then cautiously approached her. "Margaret, I'd like to help you in some way. I don't expect your forgiveness, but maybe I can be of use here." Margaret looked at him, surprised. She had noticed a change in Harold, but his offer seemed so far removed from the man she once knew that it took her a moment to process. "You want to work here?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yes. If you'll let me. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm learning to be humble. Maybe, by working here, I can start to make amends." Margaret paused, considering his words. "If you want to help, Harold, I won't stop you. But here, we're all equals. It doesn't matter who you were or what you had in the past." Harold nodded firmly. He started at the restaurant with the simplest tasks, washing dishes, sweeping floors, and even serving customers. He felt the weight of curious glances but didn't let it deter him. Each day was a lesson in respect and empathy, values he had once dismissed. For Harold, the work wasn't just about making things right with Margaret, it was about reconciling with himself. He began to find beauty in the little things he had once ignored, the connection between people, the joy of customers enjoying a well-prepared meal, and Margaret's resilience, which inspired him to strive for more. Margaret, meanwhile, watched from a distance. She still wasn't sure she could fully trust Harold, but she saw something she hadn't expected, a man genuinely trying to change, not with words, but through actions. Their relationship began to shift gradually. Harold was no longer just a painful reminder of the past but someone who was slowly learning to share and grow. The months that followed brought changes no one could have predicted. Harold, once known for his coldness and arrogance, had transformed. He wasn't just an employee at Margaret's restaurant but a dependable presence for the other staff, always ready to lend a hand. Margaret observed with cautious optimism. While some emotional scars remained, she couldn't deny seeing something genuine in Harold, a determination to be better. And though she didn't voice it, it moved her. One night, after closing, Margaret and Harold stayed behind to tidy up. The silence between them was comfortable but carried an unspoken weight. It was Harold who broke it. "Margaret, when I look at all of this, I see how much you've built. I don't know if you realize it, but this place saved my life." Margaret turned to him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "I built this because I had no choice, Harold. You took everything I thought I had. But somehow, that gave me the strength to find something I didn't even know I possessed." Harold lowered his head. "I know. And I'm deeply sorry. But, Margaret, working here taught me something I never understood before, the value of people. You didn't just save your life, you saved mine too." Those words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Margaret didn't respond immediately. Instead, she placed a hand on Harold's shoulder and said simply, "Then make it count." In the months that followed, Harold continued to prove his sincerity. He helped Margaret expand the restaurant, offering ideas and even connecting her with investors who were motivated not by profit but by the impact the restaurant had on the community. Margaret watched her dream grow beyond anything she had imagined. The restaurant became more than just a place to eat, it was a hub for connection, resilience, and hope. People came from far and wide to experience the food and hear the story behind each dish. Despite everything, Margaret knew the pain Harold had caused would never fully disappear. But she also realized that forgiveness wasn't just for him, it was for her, to free herself from a past she couldn't change. In the end, the two found something neither had been looking for, mutual respect and an unexpected connection. It wasn't about forgetting the past but about learning from it. And so, Margaret and Harold moved forward, their lives intertwined, not out of obligation, but by choice. Because sometimes, it's through life's most painful lessons that we find the deepest transformations. If you were Margaret, could you have forgiven Harold? And if you were Harold, what would you have done to try to make things right? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Stay tuned for another emotional story.